think it's important. I personally find interesting, and I think worthy of our attention here in the United States. Would also like to express condolences to those who lost their lives in Taiwan with the recent earthquake, and also commend the efforts made by the Tsai administration for mitigating and responding to the disaster that happened. It's truly a sad event. But also highlights the opportunities for the international community to do a lot more to be able to work with Taiwan, not only in helping to mitigate some of their natural disasters, but also to recognize the contributions that Taiwan can make to helping out the United States and the rest of the world in some of our natural disasters. So I'd like to first make that point. Just a quick war story, then I'm going to turn it over to Rachel for introductions. I was a retired Air Force officer, and one of my highlight of my career was spending 3 years in what used to be called West Berlin. West Berlin, positioned right in the middle of East Germany, and the only ways to get in and out of West Berlin, by land there was one highway that you could take to get out, and by air there were 3 corridors that went out. And the corridors were, if you can imagine, like a tube. It was very somewhat restricted in terms of airspace that you could go, and all this was the basis of negotiations between the tripartite forces, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, together with the former Soviet Union. One of the highlights when I was in this position is what we did was monitor Soviet and East German flight activity in and around the corridors for freedom of access into and out of West Berlin. And one of the things that watching very carefully through the years, looking for gradual changes, and when they made, they would do what's called reserving airspace, where they would take blocks of the airspace at different altitudes to be able to, for example, they had an exercise coming up. And one of the trends and one of the concerns, long-standing concerns, particularly toward the end of my tour, which was I left in 1989, was the possibility of the Soviets gradually choking off airspace and access to and from Berlin as an instrument of coercion. And these were slight changes that they made, but they were traceable over time, and that was a real concern. I say this because our topic today is for our event is entitled Under the Radar, China's Coercive Air Power in the Taiwan Strait. And I think it's an important and appropriate topic. I have another war story I can tell later to put this in context, but for now, I'd like to turn it over to Rachel Burton for our introductions.
Thanks, Mark, and a happy New Year to you all, and welcome to our event today. And I'm really excited to have this distinguished panel of experts here. We're here to discuss the PRC's coercive airspace management, Taiwan security, and implications for U.S. interests. I've asked them to explore linkages between these new PRC civil air routes, expanded PLA flight activity in the Western Pacific, and prospects for the PRC's establishment of an air defense identification zone over the Taiwan Strait and beyond. So, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please keep your seatbelts fastened as we may come up against some unexpected turbulence during this panel on Friendly Skies. So Mark, turning it back over to you, who is China's State Air Traffic Control Commission, and how do these air routes fit into Beijing's broader political military agenda?
Wow, I didn't expect that. But let me answer that question. I putting this into somewhat of a broader context, and with another story. And the reason why I got to know some of this particular organization. I was in West Berlin for a few years, but then topped it off with a perhaps even more interesting assignment, which was 3 years as an assistant air attaché in Beijing, the U.S. Embassy. In 1994, there was a freeze in U.S. military relations after the Tiananmen massacre, and then and there was a slight unfreeze toward the 1993 timeframe, and then ultimately with the visit of Secretary Perry in 1994. There were a series of initiatives that were announced. One of them called the Military to Civilian Conversion Initiative. A subset of this initiative was an air traffic control initiative, and I had the opportunity to be able to be involved in this, both in Beijing and then subsequently when I served on the air staff and the director of operations. In this initiative, air traffic control initiative, part of the goal on the U.S. side, sincerely, was to be able to enhance the safety of flight in the skies over China. Indirectly, it also, of course, there was my impression of business angle, which, of course, if you increase the efficiency of flights, the flight routes, then may lead to greater sales. But the biggest problem was the not exclusive, but near exclusive control that the PLA had over the airspace and skies over China. With the exception of 3 corridors, they're called the Golden Triangle, which were the corridors going from Beijing to Shanghai, Shanghai to Guangzhou, and then from Guangzhou to Beijing. When I say control over airspace, in almost every sense, you had CAAC, China Aviation, Civil Aviation Administration of China, CAAC for short. But the organization that was in control and established policies on behalf of the State Council, this was civil and military leadership, was something called the State Air Traffic Control Commission of China. And within the commission, ostensibly headed by a vice premier, but in any of these state commissions, the office is critical. And as the office it does, on day in and day out, administrative, basically taking a big blank piece of paper and drawing out policies and plans and approving use of that airspace, and also to approval authority for new air routes. The office resided, was dual-headed within the PLA's General Staff Department, Operations Department. It functioned also as a bureau, air traffic control bureau. The functional head of the State Air Traffic Control Commission was dual-headed as a vice deputy chief of the General Staff. At the time, it was Clay Fu Lin. This system exists all the way up until today and is very relevant to what we're looking at because the PLA still maintains control over the airspace. So that's sort of a direct answer that in terms of policies, all the way from, when I say airspace management, it also includes things like, notionally, let's say, if you have the staffing that goes into the establishment, for example, of an air defense identification zone. Also, you'll have civilian statements that would be made, but ultimately the authority for airspace management throughout China, skies over China, and in terms of their policies in the Taiwan Strait and around Taiwan, ultimately come down to the PLA. When it comes, and there's a conscious policy linking air defense and air traffic control in terms of their basic guidance. There is some independence in some air routes that the Civil Aviation Administration of China has, but ultimately it's the PLA in control.
Thanks. Could you talk a little bit more about, in your view, how was this M503 route likely to be decided? Was it really China Air Traffic Control that was like, hey, there's a lot of flight congestion and we need to solve this? And then the PLA very kindly stepped in and said, absolutely, here's how we'll do it. Could you talk a little bit about how you think that scenario might have come up?
One can only speculate, but maybe the best way to answer this question is to go back through the history of this. In terms of establishment of air routes, basically the guiding hypothesis is that there's going to be not a single reason why they would have proposed to do this particular air route in 503, going both in terms of the original route and of course the modification of that route and the addition of 3 spurs to that route. But this issue, at least publicly, was first, at least as far as I've seen, was first raised in 2007 in reporting out of Taiwan. At the time in 2007, there was again, in the media, this issue raised, and again, according to the media, I forgot if it was China Times or United Daily News that first raised it, but it was raised as a concern, and raised as a concern to American Institute in Taiwan, and brought back to Washington. Interesting because it was placed in the context of an air defense identification zone. In terms of concerns, limited concerns over the route and how there's going to be concerns from a pure military perspective. But linkage all the way up to 2007 about this being part of a broader plan to be able to assert sovereignty, not just over the Taiwan Strait, but also over Taiwan itself, to include possibility of establishing an air defense identification zone. Shortly thereafter, in 2008, there was an editorial in Xinhua, which is very interesting, that the topic of it was why we need to establish an air defense identification zone. Within the Xinhua editorial, it described that we can start with something in the East China Sea, and then eventually lead to the Taiwan Strait, eventually lead to an ADIZ over the Taiwan Strait. And sure enough, in 2013, there was an ADIZ established in the East China Sea. And by the way, there's analysis of it that we published. It's hidden a bit, but we published in 2015, I think, on this issue, this exact issue on the ADIZ and the background behind the ADIZ. It's often, the air defense identification zone is often viewed as, as a maritime issue or something related to Japan. But when you look at the background of this, and just imagine, in terms of, you look at why they established the ADIZ, in terms of the geo-coordinates, why they did. If you look at the graphic that's in the publication that we put out in 2015, you'll see the reason why they established the geo-coordinates when they came out of China. And then notionally, if you use the same rationale, it has to do with air surveillance. And then if you apply that, what could be a South China Sea one, and just imagine when you have Taiwan in the, it looks, if there's a gap there. If they had one in East China Sea, one in South China Sea. And so this has long been an area of concern. The next part of this, of course, was in 2015 when they were through negotiations. I forgot the exact name of the two associations that were engaged. It was something like Taipei Air Transport Association, and there was a counterpart on the Beijing side, on the China side. To be able to negotiate. There were some concerns, I believe in early 2015, some concerns about this. Eventually, through this process of negotiation, there were limitations that were put out, and there were pledges made on the Beijing side on limitations. Not doing, for example, the spurs that would go from the main route, and also making that the 503 route going through the Taiwan Strait, making that one particular direction. Most concern, though, if I just add one last point on this, of most concern, if you look at it's published, it's out, you can look at the agreement that came about, is something that doesn't get a lot of attention, but if you look closely at the statement from the Beijing side, where it was a claim that Taiwan Strait is I believe, a Chinese sea. Bear in mind Beijing's position that there's one China, Taiwan's part of China, and the PRC is the sole representative of China. One of the first things you start thinking of is, are they claiming that Taiwan Strait is PRC or PRC waters? And perhaps even the airspace, PRC waters? I mean, this is something that I think has not gotten a lot of attention. But a short answer is, in terms of the process, how they came to this decision, ultimately, not 100% smoking gun, but ultimately, I believe it would really come down to a decision in part of some overall concept that's developed by the Central Military Commission.
And Mark, there's been a lot of discussion in Washington, D.C. and around the world about Chinese political warfare, Chinese influence operations, and how does the M503 route fit into that? And perhaps you can talk about it through the lens of the three warfares, or legal warfare, media warfare, and psychological warfare. And how has Beijing been able to use this Silver Air Route issue as means to pressure President Tsai or Taipei?
Let me first, without getting off on a tangent, I'm not sure, I tend not to use the word three warfares because it was very narrow and in focus, but influence operations more generally, certainly this appears to be part of a broader effort. When you start looking at coercion, at least in the Air Force, U.S. Air Force doctrine, or at least theory on coercive air power, you start off with instinct, what exactly, with some specificity, you're trying to achieve. And on the other end, you have actions. And in the middle is something called the mechanism. In other words, how are actions intended to achieve your end state, which can be somewhat fuzzy because they're very difficult to prove. The end state, in terms of the immediate end state on this, again, this is sort of a subjective analysis, but the problem here with this air route issue is it was unilateral. arguably it was coercive in nature and potentially changing the status quo, particularly in terms of the international nature of Taiwan Strait in terms of being international water space, but also the airspace. And that's problematic. But the more immediate end state, of course, the reason why ostensibly they didn't feel the need to be able to negotiate these changes, because they said this is an internal China issue. We don't need to negotiate, which is bogus by itself. Because one of the real reasons they've cut off Beijing, the burden really lies on Beijing. This is not Taipei's issue. Perfectly willing to negotiate. But the end state, arguably, because they believe that trying to coerce the Tsai administration to concede on what is called a so-called 92 consensus, but in effect, it's conceding on the current administration to be able to concede on a one China principle, which would DPP, if it's KMT, that's fine. That's one of their long-standing positions. There's one China until it's part of China. The ROC is that one China. For the DPP, in terms of long-standing positions, this would be a major concession. Frankly, not realistic. DPP's long-standing position. My understanding is that things like one China is an issue to be negotiated and not unilaterally conceded. And so the end state is to create international pressure, in my view, to bring the Tsai administration to a negotiating table or concede on a very unfavorable basis. The mechanism exactly what they intend to do on this, it's not clear. But again, the most disturbing aspect of this is potentially this issue of gradually choking off airspace and with both the waters, in international waters in the Taiwan Strait and airspace, claiming this to be PRC territory.
Thank you. And we're going to move to Michael Chase, who is a senior political scientist at RAND Corporation, where his current research focuses on Chinese military modernization, China's nuclear policy and strategy, and nuclear force modernization. And to go on, Taiwan's defense policy and Asia-Pacific security issues. Michael, what are your thoughts kind of on the M503 routes, and could you discuss a little bit about how you connect the civil air routes to the PLA's Air Force and increasing activities around Taiwan?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for inviting me, first of all, and to everyone for joining us. I think Mark Stokes really put this in the broader context that you have to look at what China is doing in terms of a kind of multifaceted strategy to achieve its regional objectives in a kind of broader sense, and then with respect to Taiwan, a multifaceted strategy that involves diplomatic, economic, military, and sort of political or informational pressure or coercion of various sorts to try to achieve its goals vis-a-vis Taiwan. And as Mark said, those goals may be unrealistic for for Beijing. If it's to get the DPP to change their position on 92 consensus and the sort of core content of it being one China, well, I don't think they're going to do that. I don't see why they would. If it's maybe when you combine it with the sort of the influence operations and all that, is it to try to undermine the Tsai administration or boost the prospects of whoever they think would be better for them in the longer run? Well, that's a possibility. I mean, there are I think a number of different possibilities here. But what I want to talk about a little bit is where the kind of military signaling, the military kind of coercive diplomacy aspect of things fits in here. And I think it's fair to say that the civil aviation issues are just another tool in the toolkit that Beijing feels like it has available to it to try to put more pressure on Taiwan, right? So I'm going to talk about a sort of different set of tools, which is how China uses military power to signal its resolve, to try to intimidate, to try to coerce, or whatever the case may be. And when you look at this, I think there are really three considerations you have to keep in mind. The first one really is the goals. We've talked about those, and as Mark said, there's a little bit of uncertainty about precisely what they entail. I mean, at the broader regional security level, I think it's actually pretty clear. I mean, it's if you look at Xi Jinping's Sika speech and some of the other things that they've been saying publicly, if you look at the language that appears in the defense white papers and so on, it's relatively clear to me that what China is trying to do is to kind of undermine the influence of the U.S., to diminish the threat that they think that the U.S. alliance system poses to China's ability to achieve its own objectives, and to kind of gradually, or maybe not so gradually, increase their own power and influence so that they can kind of create a regional security order that is more favorable to Chinese interests, where they're the most influential country, where other countries, including U.S. allies and partners, by and large defer to Chinese preferences, or at a minimum refrain from directly challenging China's interests, right? So they're trying to create a regional security order where they are, the most powerful, most influential country. Right? That I think is pretty clear. And again, with respect to Taiwan, we can discuss and debate and try to figure it out. But then the other two things I think you need to look at, you have to look at the capabilities that are available to them and how those are changing. And then you have to look at the means of communication, the mechanisms or the channels that they have available to send those messages and how those are changing. On capabilities, obviously air and naval power in particular are really developing in ways that give China some new military signaling options. They can use the aircraft carrier and associated surface vessels to try to display military power and send a message to Taiwan or to other countries in the region. And likewise, as their Air Force capabilities improve, as they develop their bomber capabilities and go out and conduct longer range bomber flights, they can start to do things that they would probably see as kind of modeled on the U.S. and Russian long range aviation. And I think the Chinese 2C bombers is a pretty flexible means of signaling, so they're using them for that. Now, of course, when they go out and fly bombers, whether it's down to the South China Sea or up near Japan, or if they're flying around Taiwan, as they've done on a number of occasions, there are multiple purposes. Right? Part of it is for military training. Part of it, I think, is for kind of sending a message to their domestic audience in China. But a big part of it too is for sort of coercive diplomacy or to send kind of a military signal to the Philippines if it's in the South China Sea, to Taiwan, of course, is what we're interested in today. And so in recent years, we've seen that the PLA Air Force will fly over the Miyako Strait and around Taiwan, and Bashi Channel, going kind of around Taiwan's east coast, and going the other direction, over the Bashi Channel, around Taiwan, through the Miyako Strait to go back to China. So here's a sense in which they have expanded their capabilities, and therefore have some new ways that they can display their military power. But then the third issue is, how do you signal that? And how do you make sure that all the audiences that you want to see it, see it? And so for the domestic audience, of course, they've got official media, they've got, that can reach an international audience too. But there's some different things that they can do now. They can use social media as well. So the PLA Air Force has its own microblog in Chinese, and they display some of these activities on the microblog. Now, of course, they know that that's available to an international audience, but I think they do that mainly, primarily for an internal audience. When they want to make sure an external audience sees it, that's what Twitter is for. That's what there are other options. And so we see, the People's Daily Twitter account, State Council Information Office Twitter account, and so on, that can display, photographs, videos of PLA Air Force activity related to Taiwan or to South China Sea or whatever. And recently, People's Daily Twitter had about a 2 or 3 minute video of PLA Air Force H-6K bombers flying, I believe it was over the South China Sea, and they showed the tankers refueling them and kind of displayed that activity to make sure that the target audience, which in that case was obviously an international one, would see it. And so I think this kind of presents a dilemma to Taiwan. When you put it together with the civil aviation routes, all the economic coercion and everything else, it's again, it's one more means of China searching for different ways to put pressure on Taiwan. And with this one in particular, I think there's a little bit of a dilemma for Taiwan and how to respond in the information domain. I'm leaving aside all the issues about the air sovereignty and missions and the air defense options. I think one of the questions is, how much do you want to publicly say about Chinese activity? And so, different countries that are on the receiving end of some of the Chinese signaling have sort of different approaches. Japan makes a lot of information publicly available about Chinese air activity, Chinese Coast Guard activity, and naval activity, and so on. Taiwan makes some information available, but not all the time. And I think there I sense, and there are probably folks here who could give a more authoritative answer, but I sense there's a little bit of tension between wanting to be kind of open and transparent and to make sure that even if China doesn't choose to write about this in PLA Daily, doesn't choose to tweet about it, that information is out there for people to be knowledgeable about Chinese activities. On the other hand, I think getting back to this context of kind of political warfare and information warfare and everything, I think that on the other side of that calculation for folks in Taiwan is they want to be careful about not doing China's job for them. Right? And it's as if this becomes more routine. I know I've read quotes from some senior defense officials in Taiwan in Taiwan's media saying, well, we don't really want to end up kind of executing part of China's political warfare strategy inadvertently for them by talking about this every single time they do it, and kind of making it seem like it's something that we're really unable to respond to effectively, or something along those lines. So I do think that there's some balance between wanting to let people know that you're well aware of what China's doing and responding to it appropriately, and not wanting to sort of over-report, I guess, in a way that might actually reinforce the message that China is trying to send, obviously unintentionally, but I think there's some sensitivity in that respect. So hopefully that answers at least part of your question.
Yeah, and so recently the PLA Air Force Commander Lieutenant General Ding Lieheng has discussed the need for the PLA Air Force to increase the range of its power projection capabilities, as you mentioned, recently stating that exercises on the open seas will become a regular part of its training. So as the PLA Air Force increases its capabilities and is closing in on Japan's capabilities, this might lead to perhaps more tension, or for sure will lead to more tension. And the question I want to ask you is, should the U.S. and its allies and partners in the region respond to this more regular open training? And what should be U.S. objectives in mill-to-mill engagement for the year to come, as if this is their stated goal, this assumption that that's going to happen more often. So what should the U.S. do in terms of our goals and objectives for 2018? And how do we coordinate with our allies and partners on this?
Okay, well, yeah, I think absolutely, the PLA Air Force is actually being pretty open about their intentions, which are to kind of extend the range and the frequency of these kinds of flights and training activities. I think that, we can pretty much take them at their word that we're going to see more of this, that they want this to become kind of increasingly routine in a sense. And so making it increasingly routine serves their training objectives. I'm actually not sure how well it serves their signaling objectives, because if they're doing it all the time, it might be useful as a kind of a general deterrence message, but I think it might actually sort of undermine its utility as a more pointed kind of immediate deterrence message in a way, which is maybe kind of an inevitable consequence of the kind of routinization of activity that for them used to be far from routine and increasingly is just becoming what they do. So in terms of how we should respond, of course, I think when as appropriate, we need to be able to be prepared to signal back and to respond either on our own or in concert with allies and partners to let them know that either in kind of again in sort of a general deterrence framework, that we're that we are continuing to operate in areas where they want to expand their influence, that when we say that we'll fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows, we're going to keep on doing that. And that we're going to continue to work with allies and partners to make sure that we're helping them increase their own capabilities, and that we can demonstrate an ability to push back if we need to push back. Now, at the same time, I think when the senior folks in Taiwan say we don't want to kind of overplay it every time they do this, they're probably right about that politically, that there is a risk that you end up doing a little bit of China's work for them. So that doesn't mean that we totally ignore it. I think we want to let China know that we know what they're doing, and that when they are hypocritical about saying that this is actually a maritime example, not an air one, but when they say that they don't want foreign vessels conducting survey operations in their EEZ, but they go ahead and conduct them in someone else's EEZ. That doesn't mean that their view on this issue has changed. It means that they're going to say it's fine for them to do it, but not for other countries to do it to them. So we need to call them out when they do that, and make sure that a double standard in areas where they create one is clearly called out when they are engaging in that kind of behavior. As for specific agenda items, and I think you're in the U.S.-Taiwan security cooperation, was that the?
More on U.S.-China military engagement, just looking ahead, and if you have something to say about U.S.-Taiwan security engagement as well.
Okay, so on U.S.-China, I do think that probably the largest challenge for the U.S. side is that You have more PLA power projection capability. They're getting out. They're being more active. And so if you want to, if there's something that I think you can accomplish here, I think there are two things really. I don't think you're going to build a whole lot of trust and cooperation and all that.